Hello, come on in. Yeah. Yeah, but I haven't had an in-person class in weeks. A tutorial was in person. I didn't know that. But an lecture will go off Fridays. But I was at a lecture. Yes. Yeah. So I teach like a month. I really missed it. Yeah, yeah. Great. Hello. We're almost getting started, everyone. Just another, I think, minute. We'll wait. Great.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us here today for this specially curated masterclass, which is part of NUS Open House 2020. We would like to remind you to please set your phone to silent to minimize any disruption. With that, we would like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Estes, who will be talking about making the strange familiar and the familiar strange with anthropology. Dr. Estes, please.
Great, thank you very much. Well, hello everyone, welcome. It is such a pleasure to be here in person with you today. It's great to see people here, and welcome to those of you who are viewing this online via Zoom as well, and can join us virtually. So yes, my talk today is making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, an introduction to anthropology. So maybe you're thinking, what does that mean, making the strange familiar and the familiar strange? Well, we'll get to that title by the end of today's talk. So yes, I'm Dr. Jennifer Estes, and I am part of the Department of Sociology here at NUS, which the anthropology major is housed underneath. So I'm an anthropologist myself, and today I'll be talking specifically about anthropology, but you can look for our major in the sociology department when you're thinking this through in terms of logistics. All right, so what are we going to be doing here today? Well, by the end of this masterclass, you should leave with a pretty good sense of what anthropology is, right? Maybe some of you have heard of anthropology before, familiar. Maybe this is the first time you're even thinking about the discipline. But by the end of today, you should be able to explain the focus and methods of anthropology. And you should also be able to reflect on the significance of anthropology. Consider what this field could do for you, what you can gain from it. We're also going to take in a little bit more of a deep dive into one of anthropology's central concepts, and that is culture. So that by the end of today, you should be able to describe the concept of culture and analyze key aspects of it. So you'll leave with this kind of idea, having grappled with it a bit today. And in doing all of this, you should also get a pretty good sense of what it would be like to be in an anthropology classroom. If you took a class in this major, you're in a module, what does it feel like? What kinds of ideas are explored? What kinds of things do we do? Oh yeah, technical issue, hold on a second. The slides aren't showing up on Zoom, so gotta do that in a second here. Okay. All right, is it all set? Okay, great. We're back in action here. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna minimize this so that it's not. Is that okay? There we go. Okay. All right, so like I said, you should leave with also a bit of a feel of what it would be like to be in an anthropology class. So we're going to start with the last of these three learning objectives and get going with this question of ta-da, there we go. Now my clicker works. We're going to get going with this question of what is culture? So what we're going to do right now is use a very simple online polling tool, Poll Everywhere. So I invite all of you to grab out your phones or another device that you have that's connected to the internet. And if you're watching this via Zoom, you can join in as well. And go ahead and go to this website that's listed up here. So pollev.com/JEstes500. Type that in, and what should come up once you've just clicked into the program is this question. What word or words do you associate with culture? Right? Any word that comes to mind off the top of your head is a good word. Go ahead and enter one word at a time, because this is going to appear as a word cloud. So you can enter more than one word, but do one and then hit enter. All right, let's take a minute. You can brainstorm some ideas and we'll see what comes up. All right, so we've got tradition coming up big in the center of this, identity, community, living, diversity, right? We've got a lot of different ideas coming up around culture. Specifically, identity and tradition seem to be two of the big ones that you associate with this. So we'll unpack this a little more. So hold on to what you thought in your mind of when culture was evoked. And we'll kind of start to break this concept down a little bit more. To do so, I want you to consider this question. There we go. Take a look at these four pictures. So we have here raw horse meat, stir-fried noodles, blue cheese, or cornmeal. And I want you to consider, do any of them look delicious to you? Would you try one of these? Would you eat one of these on a regular basis? Maybe something here looks disgusting to you and you never want to try it. So think about that and go ahead and fill out this poll on Poll Everywhere, which is, which would you rather eat? Okay, so select one of these. Raw horse meat, stir-fried noodles, blue cheese, or cornmeal. Take a minute to think about this and then we'll take a look at where we're at as a group here. All right, so answers are still coming in. Go ahead and continue, but let's take a look at what we have so far. Okay, 82% of you so far would eat stir-fried noodles. There are some takers for some raw horse meat and some blue cheese. So far, no one's going for the cornmeal, right? We've got pretty much a consensus in this group of what looks like the most desirable food with some variation. Now, why am I bringing up food if I'm actually talking about culture? What is this teaching us when we ask this question? Well, in some ways, we've already kind of discovered what culture is by thinking about what food you want to eat. Culture is what gives us answers to small, kind of everyday, mundane questions, like what looks good to you to eat? Now, some of your desire to eat a certain food over another is obviously your own idiosyncratic taste, right? We all like sweet food or salty food or whatever it is that we went with. But more broadly, what we come to think of as appropriate food, what even counts as food in the first place, and what would be good to eat is shaped by the broader context. In other words, the cultural milieu that we are a part of. Okay? There are certain ideas about what constitutes food and what doesn't. So take raw horse meat. Some of you wanted to have that raw horse meat, but a lot of you didn't choose that one. There are places, for example, across many parts of Central Asia, places like Kazakhstan, where raw horse meat is considered a delicacy. Japan, France, raw horse meat is eaten there as well. But for many people in the United States, where I'm from, the idea of eating horse meat, let alone raw horse meat, is totally repulsive because horses are cute, fluffy, sweet animals that are our friends. Why would we ever eat them? Right? This falls well beyond the category of what we would consider an appropriate food to eat. Right? So culture is what is shaping some of these ideas about something as simple and seemingly inconsequential as what we like to eat. At the same time, culture is also what helps us answer really big, profound questions about life. Like, how to be a good person? What does it mean to be good? How do we interact with others? What constitutes a good life? What's the meaning of life? All of these questions, the framework we have for thinking about them, the way we approach these questions, and the way that we act on them are shaped by culture as well. Culture is all around us all the time. It's the water we swim in, so to speak. Now, there are lots of specific definitions of culture, many of them, and there's no one singular right one. If we had to kind of pin it down, here's one definition that I like. It's coined by the anthropologist Ken Guest, but here's one for you. A system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts, and institutions that are created, learned, shared, and contested by a group of people. That's a lot of things, right, that constitute culture. So we can think about this definition, and we can also continue to kind of break it down a little bit more and think through some of these components, or in other words, kind of the building blocks that can help us understand culture. So let's do that. One of the major sort of parts, components, as it will, of culture is norms. Now, norms refer to shared ideas about the way things ought to be done. In other words, this is shared with a group, and it's kind of our expectations about what's appropriate. You can also think about these as informal rules of behavior. So we can think of lots of examples of norm. Food that we just discussed, what you think is good to eat. That's an example of a norm. You can also consider greetings. So everybody close your eyes for a minute, right? And picture greeting someone. What do? Do you hug that person? Do you shake their hand? Do you wave at them from a distance? Some other way of greeting them? Also, who was that person? Right, you all pictured someone that you greeted, but I'm going to guess if you pictured your grandma, you were going to greet her very differently than if you pictured your boss at work. Probably not going to go give your boss at work a big hug and a kiss on the cheek, right? So not only do how we greet people, but also how we greet certain people, these norms are shaped by the cultural context. So for instance, in France, it might be perfectly appropriate to greet someone that you've met for the first time with a kiss on the cheek. In another context, kissing someone on the cheek might never be appropriate unless it's someone you're really, really intimately close to already. Right? So these simple things are shaped by culture as well. We can also think about bigger, sort of major components of our lives that are shaped by cultural norms. So take marriage as one example of this. Now, in many places, the idea of a long-term monogamous heterosexual marriage between two people is treated as a norm. But this is not always the case. Across time and across space, this idea of marriage isn't always the way it is. I'll give you just two examples. So one, amongst the Buid ethnic group, they're an indigenous ethnic group in the Philippines, monogamous marriage between two people, this is the norm, but marriage isn't expected to be something very long-term. You're not necessarily expected to commit to one single partner for life if you marry them. In fact, most Buid people go through at least 5 marriage partners on the course of their life. This is completely normal and expected that these partnerships don't last forever and people will move on to different partners. So what this means is that in this context, the ceremonies and the laws surrounding marriage are very simple, very easy to get married and very easy to get divorced, right? There's shared child rearing arrangements so that it's not unusual for children to be raised by multiple parents based on the marriages that they've been in throughout their life. Take another example. How many people is it considered appropriate and normal to marry? Well, we can think about examples across the world and historically as well of polygamous marriages. And that is where one person marries multiple spouses. To give you a specific case of this, we can think about polyandrous marriages in Tibet. To say a marriage is polyandrous means that one woman is married to multiple husbands. And in this case of the family picture here, there's children in this marriage. And in polyandrous marriages in Tibet, the children would be considered just as much the children of any of the husbands involved in this marriage, regardless of who the biological father is. Right? So a completely sort of different marriage arrangement and different understandings of parenthood than you would get out of monogamous marriage. Right? So these kind of norms shape all the kinds of things that we do. We can also think of another component of culture as values. So this refers to shared ideas about what is true or right or good in the world. Now, a value can be something very abstract, like valuing independence or valuing honesty. It can be something a little bit more concrete, like the degree to which money is valued in a context. Is it a good thing to be rich and have a lot of money, or does that mean you're greedy and you're hoarding, right? Some of these ideas. You can think about it concrete, like how much is, well, a marriage valued? How central is that to the meaning of life? You can also think about something that you might not even think of as value per se, but is shaped by these ideas about what is good, true, right. That is something like beauty standards. What is considered beautiful in any given context? So consider these 3 photos up here. You see someone with purposeful scarring in Sudan, someone wearing brass ring necks in Myanmar, and someone with tattoos in the United States. These are 3 forms of body modification that are very culturally specific, right? The idea of this being appropriate and beautiful wouldn't necessarily translate into other cultural contexts, where this might be seen as unusual at the very least, or perhaps inappropriate. So this is going to depend on the context that you're in, what you think, what kind of body modification is appropriate and beautiful. You can also see here how values would shape norms, right? Because what we think of as good or beautiful, right, is going to shape what we do. In other words, here's the value about what's beautiful shaping what people do with their bodies. Symbols are another big part of culture. And at its simplest, a symbol just means something that represents something else and conveys meaning to people. So actually language is a system of symbols, right? I'm talking and I'm conveying meaning to you by just speaking to you. If I say the word tree, you can picture a tree. That word is a symbol for a tree, right? So we have shared languages based on the cultural context in which we're raised in that allow us to communicate. But we can also think of all other kinds of symbols. So religious symbols are one. Many religious traditions have lots of different symbols that convey different ideas about that religion, both to the followers of that religion and to those outside. So Sikhism is a religion practiced primarily in the Punjab region of India. For Sikhs, one of the symbols of this religion is for people to not cut their hair, right? And for men, often to wear their long hair up in a turban. Now, maybe you've never heard of this, maybe you've never even heard of Sikhism, and this symbol of keeping one's hair long means nothing to you, right? Therefore, nothing's being conveyed. Maybe you're a bit familiar with this, and that you know turbans and long hair are a symbol of Sikhism itself. In other words, it stands for someone being part of that religious group. Or maybe if you're Sikh yourself or very familiar, you know that not cutting your hair is a symbol of your respect for the perfection of God's creation. Right? So symbols take on different layers of meaning to people depending on their relationship to them, how much they understand that symbol, how much it conveys. I mean, you can also think about gestures, right? Look at these K-pop stars doing this finger heart. When I first saw this symbol, I had no idea what this meant. This communicated nothing to me, right? Like, is this someone being insulting to me? What does this mean? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean a heart unless you're part of the shared group that understands that this is being a heart, right? How many of you knew this was a finger heart? Yeah, okay, most of you, right? This is now kind of a globally recognized symbol that's been spread and is now used by many people throughout many parts of the globe, even though it started right in the context of South Korea. We can also think, as our last big building block of culture that we talk about here, of systems of classification. So there are culturally specific ways of classifying things to make the world seem more organized and understandable. Depending on the context that you're in, you will have different ways of basically seeing the world, of breaking it down into different categories. Let's take an example of this, colors. In the English language, generally, although not always, an English language speaker will differentiate between blue and green, right? We have those two words, blue and green. So we see that range of colors and we'll pick one of those words to use. In Cambodia, in the Khmer language, kio, one word, usually is used to stand for both blue and green, when an English language speaker would say both blue and green. A single word encompasses both those colors. It's not that Cambodians can't see those colors, or that they can't differentiate between them or have more fine-grained words to pick them out if they need to, but generally the word they would go to would be the same for both colors. In other words, the colors are literally broken into kind of different groups in the way people see and talk about them. Calendars are another example. How do we tell time? The international calendar, the Gregorian calendar is what it's called, that's used kind of globally to tell time, is based on the sun. But that particular way of telling time was only developed in the 16th century in Europe. There are lunar calendars, ways of telling time that are based on cycles of the moon, or lunar solar calendars, which use both dates based on the moon and on the sun cycle in order to determine dates, like the way Chinese New Year is determined here in Singapore. Even bigger, we can think about the way culture shapes our understanding of categories by taking, for instance, gender categories. In many contexts, gender is thought of in a binary, male or female, right? And that these are two gender categories. But this isn't necessarily the only way of thinking about gender. In fact, to give you one example, amongst the Bugis ethnic group in Indonesia, historically they have recognized 5 gender categories. Right? This really breaks down the whole idea of gender being a binary. There's 5 different gender categories. To give you just one example, one of these gender categories is bisu. You see a picture on the slide here of a bisu. Bisu is a person who's recognized to have both male and female characteristics, and to have both human and spirit characteristics. So they are part of this gender category, is bisu are connected to the divine. And historically, Bisu have played ritual roles in bestowing blessings on people. And historically, they've been advisors in the Bugis court. So that gender categories not only shape the way we think about gender, but then people's expected roles within society as well. So now I want to turn, we've sort of thought about some building blocks of culture. I want to turn to thinking about a few other characteristics of culture that are important to keep in mind. First of all, culture is learned. What I mean by that is most of what we do, these symbols, these norms, these categories of classification that we make, they're not biological. We're not born with them. In fact, most of what humans do is not biology at all. It's learned behavior. We can talk about this in terms of enculturation. We all learn to be members of a particular group. We all come to have particular cultural understandings of the world. So, a child born in Bolivia, but raised in Kenya, would be culturally Kenyan. They would have the same understandings and frameworks of the world as anyone else born in Kenya by virtue of being enculturated in that context. Some of this learning process takes place formally, like in settings like schools. We learn to be part of cultural groups. But the vast majority of cultural learning actually takes place throughout our lives in informal settings. We're absorbing this kind of information all the time. Cultures are also not bounded. And what do I mean by this? First of all, they're not isolated. No cultural group really at any point has ever been in total isolation. Humans, even way back in the deep historical past, have been in contact with each other. So we can't say, here's a cultural group, and there's a cultural group, and they're perfectly separate. We can't bound them into their own separate spheres. They're also not stuck in place, right? Say someone is born in India, and then they migrate to the United States. Do they leave Indian culture behind? No, right? Those aspects of the way they see the world and move through the world would come with them, right? Cultures aren't tied to a particular physical place. But there's also not clear boundaries where one culture ends and another begins. Consider that immigrant to the United States. When they go to the United States, are they just Indian, or are there parts of American culture that also become part of the way they see the world? What if your parents are migrants from India and you're raised in the United States? Is your cultural group just Indian or just American? No, it's far more complicated than that, right? There's not a clear distinction. And most people can identify with multiple cultural groups. It's also the case, can we even really talk about Indian culture or American culture? These are both really huge, incredibly diverse places, right? So it's hard to make these sweeping generalizations. Which brings us to the next point. That, what it says up there that's covered by the little Zoom tab, is that cultures have internal differences. Right? We can't think of these as homogeneous groups. Culture is not something that's homogeneous and that's not shared identically. It's a shared sort of framework, but within any group, people are going to live dramatically different lives. And this is in part because of stratification. That within any group, there is often to varying degrees an unequal distribution of power and resources amongst members of a group, often based on things like race or class or gender, right? Factors that shape what identities are more or less valued in that context and given access to power. So like historically in the United States, white men have held more power than women or people of color. So certainly the experience of a white man in the United States is going to be different from someone else based on this kind of stratification. Cultures are also always changing. This is not something stagnant at all. Cultures change all the time through diffusion, and that is the spread of cultural elements from one group to another. And I said they weren't bounded, so people are in constant contact, and we're always learning about new things and adopting new kinds of ways of seeing the world. There's also contestation. So people within a cultural group will debate and resist aspects of culture and act differently than the norms, right? And make change happen. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think of an example of a cultural norm here in Singapore, or perhaps another context that you're familiar with. So think of an example of a cultural norm, and then think of an example of a norm that is changing, right? That you see kind of changing right before your eyes. A way thing, remember, a norm is something, how something should be done, an informal rule of behavior. Think of an example of what a norm that is changing, and consider why and how it's changing. So to do this, I want you all to turn either behind you or lean across and find a partner. You can introduce yourself real quick and discuss this question. I'll give you 2 minutes or so to discuss this question and come up with one specific example, okay? And then we'll come back together as a group. So go ahead and find a partner and lean over to say hi to them. You can be in a trio too, if that works out. Okay, now that you've all had a chance to talk, let's jump on to Pool Everywhere again. Okay? Both you and your partner, or just one of you, however you want to work this out, go ahead and type in just a brief summary of the cultural norm that you discussed that is undergoing change right now. If you're watching online, you can enter what you were thinking about as well, okay? And we'll take a look at some of these responses as they come up on Pool Everywhere. Great, look at the vast variety of norms that you're pointing out here and the way they're changing. So we have people talking about how gender norms are changing, right? We can think about the way gender is thought about, or the way that we assign roles based on gender and how they might be changing, things like the division of labor, right? We have people talking about linguistic change through dialects and Singlish, right? How language is changing over time and what kind of norms surround how we speak to one another and what's appropriate, right? We have people talking about changes in perceptions of the LGBTQ plus community, right? Different understandings of sexuality and how marriage should be arranged or partnerships, right? We have people talking about workplace changes, and someone I noticed brought up changes due to COVID, right? Something like COVID is profoundly changing lots of norms, one of which is how we work. Do we work in person in offices? Do we work remotely? I mean, Zoom, that's a whole new thing, right? Like there's lots of changes that will be brought on by these big kinds of global events like COVID. People have brought up intergenerational changes in the way younger and older generations interact. Lots of different things. These are all ways that culture is changing actively around us, right? So when we think about culture, we can't think about it being stagnant. It's always undergoing change through contact with other groups, through internal contestation, and through the fact that everyone just does do things slightly different than the people around them. We're all kind of changing culture, whether very overtly ourselves or through smaller, more incremental ways. Okay, so thanks everyone for your thoughts on that. Now that we've been considering culture, kind of breaking it down, giving you a taste of what this idea means, and you can start to think about how it's very present, right? We're all part of cultural groups. We're in our life, we're living with culture all the time, and how cultural norms are changing here. Let's take this idea and shift into thinking about the more broad discipline of anthropology. So you get a bit of a sense of what this is about. And obviously culture is going to be central to that. Okay, so what is it? Anthropology is the study of human cultural diversity in the present and recent past, right? So culture is central to this discipline. What we're looking at as anthropologists is how this diversity manifests itself in all aspects of life. Like, you were already talking about different kinds of aspects of life, like work and gender and intergenerational relations and language when you were doing that goal, right? But we can think about everything as kind of fair game when we think about cultural diversity and the way different people move through the world and how culture shapes us. Now, one of the things that anthropologists are doing by trying to understand this cultural diversity is connecting the lives of individuals to larger social structures. So we're particularly interested in individuals, and we'll talk about what I mean by that when we discuss our methods. But what we're doing is, by studying people's lives, we're thinking about how their lives are tied into these broader norms and the way that society is organized around these kind of categories that cultural groups create, around the way we organize ourselves. So around political and economic organization, gender, issues of race and ethnicity, of class, of all these other big ways that cultural groups organize themselves. How does this shape then people's lives, their opportunities, the things they do, how they interact with one another, right? So we're connecting the individual to the broader context in which they live. Now, obviously, this is a huge thing, right? To understand human cultural diversity. So it means that anthropologists work all over the globe. And it also means that each individual anthropologist then chooses a more specific idea, topic, and group of people to work with, to explore in the course of their own research. And together we kind of build up this big picture, right? So as an individual, an anthropologist might focus on the economics of reindeer herding in Sweden. They might focus on climate change and how climate change impacts are affecting the lives of indigenous communities in Laos. They might look at how religious practices in Botswana are shaped by gender. Or maybe they're studying interactions between doctors and their patients here in Singapore, right? These are all projects that an anthropologist can and does do, right? All these different kinds of spheres of life, religion, economics, medicine, right? Examining any different kinds of sphere and working with different kinds of groups of people around the globe. Now, one of the things that really distinguishes anthropology as a discipline from other disciplines like geography or sociology that are also social scientists, right? We're all in disciplines in the university. We have connections to each other, interconnections. Obviously, this is part of the spirit of CHS as you've learned. So we think across disciplines. But if you had to kind of focus on one of the things that makes anthropology distinct, that is a commitment to something called ethnography. So ethnography is a word that has two meanings. And one of its meanings is a qualitative research strategy based on fieldwork. So in other words, when we do research as anthropologists, we go out into the real world, so to speak. We don't do research in a lab. We're out there working with people. Okay? So we do ethnographic fieldwork. Ethnography also refers to a written product, to a book or an article that provides a very close, in-depth analysis of a group of people using data from ethnographic fieldwork. Okay, so you can read an ethnography. We do ethnographic research and we write ethnographic texts. Now, ethnography is all about stories. So anthropology as a discipline is really about people and stories. We go out there and we work with people. We learn stories from people. We learn from them and we take that and interpret it and write books and articles that are very narrative, right? Trying to understand these lives of individuals in their broader social context. So I can tell you one thing. Reading anthropology is actually really fun. It's not very dry in terms of academic writing because so much of it is narrative-based. Now, when I say we go out and do ethnographic fieldwork, what does that look like, right? And I say we're focused on individuals. How do I mean that? What I mean is that an anthropologist, to do field work, goes out and lives in a community for a very prolonged period of time. Usually, someone conducts research in a field site, in other words, a specific location, or maybe multiple locations for the place where they're going to do their research, for at least a year. It's a very sustained commitment to really trying to in-depth understand the lives of the people that you're working with for your research. And we use two main methods. So participant observation is kind of the key method of anthropologists and really what is very distinct to this discipline. Other disciplines use it, but we kind of invented it. What this method means is that we go out and participate in the daily lives of the people that we are studying, that we're working with on our research. So we do everything they do, interacting with them. This is a picture of me doing my own research in Cambodia at a ceremony my neighbors were holding. You live in a community, you go to things like weddings and funerals with your neighbors, you go to specific events, say you're studying musicians, you go out there and go to with the musicians to their band practice. You probably play an instrument yourself, maybe join a band if you're studying musicians, right? Whatever the topic you're exploring is, you're with people, spending time with them in their daily lives, doing the things that they do alongside them, so that you also know what it's like to do that thing. And you have an embodied experience of it. You're doing it yourself and you're learning from people, from the act of doing it with them. And you see all this kind of dynamic about how people interact with one another. Also, in tandem with that, anthropologists use interviews. So in other words, kind of sitting down and having these one-on-one conversations with people. Now we're doing very informal, unstructured interviews all the time in the course of participant observation. You're hanging out with people for a year. You're learning from them, talking with them constantly. But we also do more formalized interviews where we'll sit down and ask people a set of structured questions in order to really get at some of the details that we're trying to seek out and understand. And with these two methods together, we can learn what people both say they do and what people actually do, and how their understanding of what they do lines up with their practices to get a really rich, big picture of people's lives and the dynamics and how these fit into these broader social structures. So I want to end today by just thinking about why anthropology is significant. This is a non-exhaustive list, right? We could think of other points too, but here's a few. So for one thing, anthropology exposes us to the lives of people around the globe, right? As a discipline, we're committed to thinking globally and exploring a diverse set of people's experiences, right? So we can learn a lot about the world out there beyond ourselves. And this is what I mean by anthropology can make the strange familiar in the context of the title. By learning about the lives of people very different from ourselves, very superficially strange, we can come to realize that all cultural practices, all ways of doing things, have their own internal logics and meanings to the people that are in those contexts and that do those practices. What once seems strange to us can be familiar. We can learn about it and understand how the world is to other people beyond ourselves, right? Or at least begin to understand that, right? Come as close as we can to learning about other people's experiences. At the same time, by learning about others, by learning about difference, this also helps make the familiar strange. In other words, we can examine our own lives, right? What's familiar to us, and realize that nothing that we do is normal or natural. We're all part of cultural groups, and what we do seems strange to outsiders, right? What we do isn't any more normal than what anybody else does. This asks us, this discipline, to kind of reflect on our own lives and question what we take for granted and examine some of that. And in doing that, in making the familiar strange, it can also inspire us to novel approaches to solve problems. We can see that things don't have to be done the way they're always done. There are lots of ways of living and being in the world and thinking about things. So it gives you new insights. And also by exploring this diversity, it can suggest ways of coexisting in an increasingly interconnected world through migration, through technologies, through all kinds of ways we're connected to people around the globe. Finally, anthropology can give you a whole sort of toolkit, right? It can give you conceptual tools to analyze current events at a global scale, to start thinking about some of the big processes that are happening in the world today. And it can also help you understand dynamics in very specific settings. So like, what's the gender dynamic within a particular classroom? What's the hierarchy of power within a workplace? You can go into settings and have tools to kind of analyze the dynamics there. It trains you in qualitative research methods, like participant observation and interviews. You learn how to do research. And it certainly hones your ability to be an excellent communicator. Right? This discipline is all about talking to people, interacting with people, learning from them, and communicating ideas about them, listening, speaking, writing, right? Very communicative. And finally, all these kinds of skills are highly sought after in both public and private sectors. These skills sort of generally, and also more and more organizations and companies are actually hiring people trained as anthropologists to do research for them. So for instance, software companies hire anthropologists to understand how people use their programs. Hospitals would hire someone to understand how patients are receiving care. There's lots of ways having this particular kind of anthropological approach can again help you think through problems and understand dynamics. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's lecture. We have time for questions. Sorry. Ooh, haven't been up in front of a live classroom in a long time. It's great, but I'm also like having to use my voice, right? So thank you so much for being here. It's really great to see all of you. If you have questions, you can ask. Sorry, or you can type into the poll everywhere poll. Again, thank you all for being here. I also just want to flag that if you want to know practical things, ooh, there's an email for an administrative email you can contact for that. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Estes, for the very engaging class. So we would like to invite you to post your questions. Please keep the questions to content related. There are mics on either side of the aisle. You can use that. And for participants on Zoom, please feel free to post your question via the Q&A or chat function.
Any takers? Type, raise your hand, whatever. Yes.
Some part of it to be considered but like I'm kind of thinking about it, like what if a culture sort of dies out, but then some part of it like continue on with another new culture, then are those practices still considered genuine of the one that existed?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're saying the answer, in my opinion, in your question. Cultures never really die per se, right? Because where does a culture just stop? It can't just be suddenly eliminated. Practices are passed on intergenerationally and they change over time, right? So yes, those practices would be carried on and it continues to morph, right? So it's not so much as something gone or dead, but how has it changed? How over time have parts of a particular cultural practice been maintained and changed over time? So it doesn't necessarily die, but certainly there are cultures that have been more dominant, that have, through processes like colonialism, where there's the imposition of power that have forced people to change their cultural practices. That's one way that cultures have been suppressed, right? But that doesn't mean that cultural practices have completely died out, right? People are always practicing in cultural norms and beliefs and values in new kind of innovative ways as they cope with whether experiences of domination or experiences of having exposure to new things. Yeah, great question. Yes.
So I have a question. I was just wondering, how do you record cultural practices in your field and in your research when there's so many like variations of it because different people will practice it to a different extent?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we set out with specific kind of research questions in mind. We're not just trying to get everything right. I'm so sorry. It's like that would be impossible, right? As you're pointing out, to do everything. So we would come into a research setting with a particular kind of question in mind, right? That you want to focus on, and you would kind of focus on that. So say you were a medical anthropologist working in a hospital, you weren't going to document everything about how medicine works in that setting, but you might be particularly interested in how assisted reproductive technologies are used in that context and how that shapes gender norms. Right? Who is expected to use these technologies? I'm just using one, it's a real example, studying an anthropologist studies. You would kind of focus in on that. You would also spend a long time trying to work through this question by talking to a wide variety of people. Say you'd be in a hospital and you'd be talking to all kinds of different doctors and different patients. You'd be doing background reading. You'd be trying to understand all of this. You would take extensive notes as you were doing this research. based on your participant observation and your interviews, and you use that to analyze it within that particular kind of context, right? That then compiled with all kinds of other studies other anthropologists have done would give us a broader picture, but you yourself are going to focus in a little bit more as an anthropologist. So I hope. Okay, do anthropologists change their topic of research? If so, how often does it happen? Yeah, most anthropologists, if you're a professional anthropologist and over your career, might have a couple different big projects that you work on. But you work on one project for a long time. Like I've been doing research in Cambodia on the changing livelihoods of rural young people and their families for years now, right? I started this kind of broader research project close to 10 years ago. I'm still working on this, like writing books and articles based on this. Now, one day in a few years, I might change and find a different field site and a different sort of set of questions to ask. But oftentimes it's a pretty big gap between it because we're so committed to this really in-depth, long-term understanding. Let me scroll down to the beginning. I realized I jumped into that one. Let's see what some of the earlier ones are here. Okay. Well, okay, here we go. Does anthropology focus on qualitative research? Yes, not on quantitative. Yeah, this is a qualitative discipline. So we're not going out there doing statistics. Other disciplines do that, and that can inform us, give us some background knowledge, but we are all about the qualitative understanding of the rich details of people's lived experiences. So that's the methodological focus. What are the job prospects? Yeah, so as I mentioned very briefly, some of it is that you'll have a set of skills that can translate into a whole variety of workplace contexts. So it's less like I'm an anthropologist and I'm going to get this job because I'm an anthropologist. It's I have all these kinds of skills that can be applied in wide variety of settings where people are interested in innovative approaches and communication and problem solving and research, right? So there's many different settings where this could apply. That being said, there are, like I very briefly mentioned, companies that do specifically hire people trained in anthropology if they have a research problem that they want to solve, right? Like, so example, there was a bank here in Singapore that hired someone trained in anthropology here to look at how people used digital technologies to remit money. If they were migrants to Singapore, how they sent money back to their home communities and home families. So an anthropologist was out there working with people to try to find out what made them sort of use certain technologies to remit money, what do they prefer in these that would help shape the bank's understanding of how these kind of technologies could be used. So there's both sort of general applicability and then that you could use in a wide variety of settings that you're interested in, and then some kind of jobs like these that are looking for trained researchers. I saw in this list someone asked the difference between anthropology and sociology. They're obviously quite closely related because we're housed in the same department here in the US. We have a lot of, excuse me, we share a lot of commitments. This is across many disciplines, right? We share similar kind of understanding, some shared literature, right? Big names that we draw on. One of the distinctions is that we are specifically committed to ethnography and do that. There are some sociologists that do ethnography, but they also do more quantitative stuff, some sociologists, whereas we're focused on this kind of approach. Our writing is also more narrative, generally speaking. I mean, I'm speaking in generalizations, it'll vary depending on the anthropologist and sociologist, and tells the stories of people's lives so that you can understand that very directly versus just sometimes looking at meta pictures. Okay, so one of the differences is methodological. One of it is sort of how you present the data. Okay. And I'm happy to talk about that in a bit more depth later if anyone wants to approach me afterwards. But how many possible field research opportunities would the average student be able to experience? Yeah, great question. So a lot of classes, like all of my classes and some of my colleagues' classes, involve a fieldwork component in our modules, right? Because getting out there and doing this work yourself is so important. So for instance, like every semester I have students going out, developing a question that they want to ask based on the theme of the module, going out, doing participant observation, doing interviews. So throughout your classes, you would get to do that. There's also the option to do an honors thesis, which would be a whole year-long commitment to doing research. Is there math? Generally speaking, no. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. For me, that's a good thing, but whoever asked that, no, there's not math involved. Unless you're studying mathematicians, there are anthropologists that go out there and study scientists and how they produce knowledge. That's a big field. So you could go study mathematicians and understand how they think through the logics of math. But you yourself wouldn't necessarily be involved in that.
Maybe we'll just take the last question.
Yeah, so was there a question, anybody here or anybody on Zoom that I don't want to miss that option? Okay. Could you share one of your memorable experiences while doing field research? Yeah, so my own field research, like I mentioned very briefly, is in Cambodia. I work in a rural area of southern Cambodia. No, it's all memorable. Whoever asks us, when you mean memorable, do you mean like fun and exciting? It's pretty fun and exciting. I guess one of my favorite things is going to Cambodian weddings. So I've done a lot of stuff, but this is just like a fun fieldwork experience, right? Cambodian weddings usually have upwards of 500 guests come to them, huge social networks involved, and there's like this whole complex process of making gifts of money to the bride and the groom and how you gift and who you gift to. And then there's a big banquet held and dancers and live music. So I loved as an anthropologist going to these weddings because they're fun, right? They're this big social event where you get to interact with a whole lot of people. But I also love kind of analyzing and writing about some of these dynamics about people's social obligations when they go to weddings, how much they have to pay, how the families afford to pay for these weddings. Oftentimes people will go into debt for them or migrate to find work for the wedding. So it's really interesting to me analytically how weddings work. And they're also super fun to go to. And I also ate dog meat, if that was the kind of story that you're looking for, right? Like, so going back to our food question, is that appropriate? Like that to me as an American in my context that I grew up in, that was like an exotic food I ate. We don't really use the term exotic, right? We don't want to exoticize it. Part of anthropology is thinking about like, that's not exotic, that's a normal food. People can eat dog, like that's just different in different contexts. So, I ate dog, right? Like, and that's cool. And that helps us understand, right, that different kinds of practices are appropriate and get you out of your own kind of norms. If anyone wants to hear more fieldwork stories, more specific kind of questions they had, I'm happy to stick around afterwards if anyone has more questions, but it sounds like I have to cut it off now, right? Yes, okay, thank you everyone for being here.
Yes, thank you for all your interesting questions. If you have pre-registered for the walking tour, please head out to the tour booth outside LT11 to begin your tour. Due to safe management measures, we have limited capacity for these tours and can only accept pre-sign-ups. However, please feel free to walk around our campus or take a shuttle bus to U-Town and take part in the other activities throughout the day. So thank you and have a great day in NUS.
Yeah, thanks everyone. If any of you have additional questions, I'll be down here for another couple minutes. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.